How about Colombia?
Well, thank you very much. As you mentioned, Colombia had a very definite role in terms of formulating the SDGs. We worked on that before the Rio conference in 2012. We had the idea of moving towards a more comprehensive set of goals, not only goals developed and focused on growing economies and on emerging economies. The things about, for example, inclusive growth, about gender equality, are things that are not only affect developing economies, but also developed economies. So we wanted to set up an agenda that at first was met with very high skepticism, why Colombia was doing this. But then afterward, I think it was very successful, and now there's we already know the SDGs. So Colombia moved forward starting from 2014 once the SDGs were already set up, in incorporating most of the objectives in the National Development Plan. It's kind of the roadmap for the new government. What are the main policies that are going to be attacking the objectives, how to set up those goals, what are the private and public actors involved in attaining those goals. And we also have a monitoring scheme, which is very important. The private sector wants to get involved with the completion of these objectives, but then it wants to, of course, have a good say in the monitoring, how the projects are evolving, what's the financing involved. So it's important to have the monitoring as well. Now, in terms of inclusive growth, so the Colombian government has been working, I'd say, in two main dimensions. First, peace process. The peace process is one of the few good news that the world economy has this year. We completed the peace process on last year. The guns were handed out by the guerrilla movement, the FARC, a couple of months ago. That's going to have not only an economic dividend, but also an environmental dividend. The guerrilla used to, for example, had some, plant some bombs with oil pipelines that spilled the water sources, and that had an enormous environmental impact, and that's going to end with the peace process. Now, the other part, of course, more micro-focused is especially education. Education in terms of tertiary education, professional education in Colombia has been very backward. The access has been very low. We managed to increase the access from 32% of total population to 51% in 5 years. So that's very important, unlocking the productivity of human capital, that's key. And also helps with the thing that you were mentioning before, Minister, the appropriation of technology. If you have the infrastructure, if you have access to broadband, but you don't know how to use it, well, we're not gonna be unlocking productivity. And that, finally, I tie that to the other agenda, which is the fact that Colombia, even though has had, well, this civil conflict for more than 50 years, has had a remarkable macroeconomic stability. It's probably one of the few Latin American economies that didn't have a default on its public debt since the 1930s. We have never had a hyperinflation. So it's a very remarkable, stable economy. We have grown around 4% for the past 20 years on average. Now, where are the sources of growth coming from? Essentially two. Investment, where we now have an investment rate which is close to 30% of GDP, the highest in Latin America, and also the increased labor supply. So the demographic changes have increased labor supply, and the unemployment rate has come down for the past 15 years. Now, those two sources of growth are probably coming to an end. What's left is productivity growth, where Colombia has had tremendous problems in increasing productivity growth. Now, the agenda of education, of technology appropriation, and of course, one important impact, which is regulation, better regulation, is going to have, we think, an important impact in the medium term of increasing productivity growth, which is the one that we feel is going to have an impact on inclusive growth.
And does better regulation mean deregulation?
What I mean by better regulation is making sure that the benefit of regulation exceeds its cost to the private sector. Of course, there are things that we need to regulate. Regulation is important, especially for environmental issues. But sometimes the process of regulation doesn't consider the alternatives or the unintended consequences of regulation. Just to mention a number, we did an inventory of regulation that was issued for the 21st century in Colombia, and there were 2.7 decrees per day signed by the president for the past 17 years. So this is probably a problem of inflation of regulation. The quality probably is not going to be that high. So we're setting up a program where we are doing a widespread review of the process to guarantee the quality of regulation, which is important for the productivity growth. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, that's in terms, we've heard about how to make economies more productive and how to try and spread some of the benefits.
I just want to comment on one of the questions that asked about the importance of cities. I didn't want to pass up on that question. So every country, again, it's tied to its own dynamic. Colombia is a very urban economy. More than 70% of the people live in large cities around the country. But one of the things we're working on is land use planning. We have at least 30% of the land properties that is outdated. Around 80% of the municipalities have outdated lands and use plans. So we're implementing what we call a multi-purpose cadastre, which is essentially planning with up-to-date information with one important component, which is adaptation and mitigation of climate change, which has been disregarded for the plans that were constructed 8 or 12 years ago. So I mentioned this, well, that sounds like an important issue for developing economies, but for example, in Houston, I just read the past month that Houston is the largest city in the US that doesn't have any land zone regulations. And that's when you think about things that affect the environment, the flooding effect, for example, well, you think about the importance of regulating some part of land zone use. And we're working towards that, especially in Colombia, which is a growing economy and is going to be having growing cities as well. The importance of having these components in terms of mitigation to climate change towards the long term.
Right, thank you. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, I